You are watching NewsX. Well, let's take a look at some of the top stories. US President Donald Trump has vowed not to be intimidated by Russian President Vladimir Putin ahead of their high-stakes Alaska summit scheduled for later today, promising Ukraine would be included in any deal even as Kyiv is left out for the talks as of today. This visit will mark Putin's first visit to the US since 2022. Russian energy facilities were targeted in drone attacks ahead of a crucial meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska tonight. President Trump has said that President Putin appeared ready to negotiate an end to the Ukraine war, but sanctions easing remains uncertain amid European resistance. Germany and the EU have urged Israel to halt plans to build thousands of new homes in the West Bank, warning that the controversial E1 settlement project undermines the two-state solution and violates international law. German officials and EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas strongly rejected the Israeli government's decision. Hezbollah has warned that Lebanon will have no life if the government moves against the Iran-backed group, raising the specter of civil war. According to media reports, Deputy Leader Naim Qassem said protests could target the U.S. Embassy and insisted Israeli attacks must end before any disarmament. China urged Cambodia and Thailand to restore peace at their border as soon as possible, reiterating support for a sustainable ceasefire, according to a Chinese Foreign Ministry statement. The call comes after a trilateral meeting which has been held yesterday. China's embassy in Japan has slammed Japanese politicians' visit to the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, calling them a reflection of the ghosts of Japan's militarism and a wrong attitude towards history of aggression, according to media reports. Meanwhile, South Korea has expressed deep disappointment and regret over Japanese officials visiting the controversial Yasukuni Shrine on the 80th anniversary of Japan's World War II defeat, calling for remorse for past wrongs. Seoul has warned that future relations depend on Japan's historical accountability. At least 52 people have been killed and over 200 remain missing after flash floods and landslides swept through the Indian Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowed to protect farmers, announced lower GST rates from October, and urged self-reliance in manufacturing amid trade tensions with US President Donald Trump during his speech celebrating Independence Day today. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Moscow will not make any prediction on the outcome of Friday's summit between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Speaking to Russian state television after landing in Alaska for the talks, Lavrov has said that Russia's position is clear and unambiguous and will be presented directly during the meeting. This comes as exiled Russian opposition figure Yulia Navalnaya has urged Presidents Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to strike a deal to free Russian and Ukrainian political prisoners held captive by Moscow for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. Navalnaya, whose husband Alexei Navalny died in a Russian prison last year, said this in a video message on social media, hours before the two leaders are set to meet in Alaska today. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Madhav Nalapat. He's the editorial director at TSG. Thank you, Madhav Nalapat, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, Lavrov has stated that Russia will not predict the outcome of this summit. Given the sensitive issues at hand, how do you see this approach influencing the atmosphere of the talks?
Well, look, for the Russians, quite frankly, Alaska is a big deal. And for President Trump, it's a huge feather in his cap where newspaper headlines are concerned. The media of the whole world will be looking at the Alaska summit between Putin and Trump, because Putin will finally have come in from the cold after he began this war with Ukraine. And no less a person is, and the president of the U.S. is now breaking bread with him in Alaska. So from the point of view of President Putin, the fact is that these territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, were essentially Russian territories that were given to the then Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was part of the unified Soviet Union. And it was basically given, if I remember, by Ukrainian-speaking General Secretary of the all-powerful General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And for the majority of its unhappy period as a communist country, the Soviet Union was under the control of general secretaries who were Ukrainian. So the majority of, the sense of the majority of those who held that position were Ukrainian, not Russian speaking. So the reality of the situation is, as far as Russia is concerned, they will not stop trying to annex the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk, because these territories, they believe, were ceded to Ukraine when they were both unified under the USSR. And now that Ukraine has gone its own separate way, very much its own separate way, the Russians would want these territories to be back, as well as Crimea. And I don't believe they're going to do any adjustment unless it involves a full restoration of those boundaries that were there prior to the secession, the handing over of these Russian-speaking territories to the Ukraine by under what was then the unified Soviet Union. So I do not see any prospect of the Russians abandoning their stand of going full tilt and getting back the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Thank you, Madam Nalapad. And now also looking at Yulia Navalnaya, who is a widow of Navalny, urging both leaders to strike a deal for the release of political prisoners. How likely is it that this issue can be discussed at the table today?
Well, it can be discussed, and it's a great tragedy. I think, there are many prisoners of war held by Ukrainians and by the Russians, and an exchange would be welcome from a human rights point of view. Whether that's going to be arrived at, I'm not very sure. I don't think, frankly, that President Putin is in the mood to make any concessions to the Ukrainian side at this point in time. So given that, I'm not very sure that the prisoner exchange situation will come about. But if it does come about and the Russians do agree to prisoner exchange, well, then that will be another big feather in the cap of President Trump. And I think, the Russians would use that possibly to buy time to finish the job of reclaiming the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Thank you, Madam Nalapad, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. In Kyiv, many Ukrainians expressed pessimism ahead of Friday's meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump in Alaska. Residents told Reuters that they believe Ukraine's interests will not be taken into account, with some saying the outcome will likely leave the situation unchanged. Pensioner Rostislav Sviatnenko warned that Russia can only be dealt with from a position of strength and will continue to seek more territory. The Alaska talks, the first face-to-face meeting between President Trump and President Putin since President Trump took office back to White House, will focus on a possible ceasefire in Ukraine alongside Putin's proposal for a nuclear accord. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was not invited this time, and European allies fear that President Trump could pressure Kyiv into making territorial concessions.
Украине это навряд ли что принесет. Трампу не доверяю. Говорит сегодня одно, завтра другое. Послезавтра третье, через 5 дней 10-е. Поэтому веры к нему никакой. Интересы Украины навряд ли будуть учитані при этой встрече.
Але, скоріше всього, це нічим, так скажемо, Так позитивним, так скоріше всього, це не закінчиться нічим. Просто це на одному місці, так як і було, так і лишиться.
Нічого доброго там не буде, бо війна є війною, вона не закінчиться. Поки її території ми нікому нічого давати не збираємося. А надія то є, але вона сильно маленька в цьому питанні.
Домовин там не буде. Україна може тільки себе відстояти зброєю, знаєте, тільки зброєю. І якщо нам будуть допомагати, в першу чергу наші сусіди, це європейці, ну і будемо надіятися на Америку, що все-таки Америка зрозуміє, що до Трампа колись дійде, що треба допомагати. Росія – це така країна, з якою можна говорити тільки з позиції сили. Добровільно вона нічого не віддасть. Нічого. І дивіться, скільки б вона не вимагала, да? Спочатку прийшла в Крим, тоді прийшла на Донбас, тоді вона, бачите, вже Херсонську область вимагає, Запорізьку область вимагає. Пройде час, у нас буде мир. І вона відновиться, знову зброїться, тому що вся економіка її поставлена на військові рейки, і рано чи пізно вони знов до нас вторгнуться. Тому я думаю, що Україна повинна тільки себе захищати. Захищати як зброєю, так і духом.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Madhav Nalapad. He's the editorial director at TSG. Thank you, Madhav Nalapad, for staying with us. Now, we saw that a lot of people in Ukraine have concerns that Trump may pressure Kyiv into territorial concessions. So what potential outcomes can arise from this ceasefire deal without Ukraine's direct involvement tonight?
Look, I would like to ask a simple question to those posing this question. How many Russians and Russian invitees were there at the innumerable meetings that several European countries have had with the Ukrainians? And when President Biden was there with the United States as the enthusiastic leader of this let's finish off Russia once and for all group. How many Russians? I can give you the answer. It's zero, none. So the fact is, Ukrainians, led by Zelensky, are not welcome at this summit. I don't think either Trump or Putin regard Zelensky as a real partner in peace. So from that point of view, what they're doing is repaying Zelensky in his own coin. The Russians were kept out of meetings with the Europeans, and now he is being kept out of meetings with the Russians and with President Trump.
And now many Ukrainians are also pessimistic about this, and you're right that Russians were never invited to these meetings in Europe. So what does this sentiment from both sides reveal about today's Ukraine's position?
Look, I would like to say I feel very sorry for the Ukrainians. They bought into this fantasy concocted for them by President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson. At that time, both of them were the presidents and prime ministers of UK and US, as I recall. I think Chancellor Schmidt and Macron. That, the reality is that, the fantasy was that the Ukrainians could win back the territories that have been lost since 2014. It is only a fantasy. And now it's been exposed as a fantasy. And the more this war goes on, and I think Zelensky, frankly, is one person who wants the war to go on. He wants an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Russians are not going to agree to that, absolutely not. They would not want a ceasefire until they have taken the territory they feel belongs to them. So every day that this war is prolonged, more Ukrainian lives and more Russian lives and more collateral damage across the world is being caused. It's tragic. The entire Ukrainian war was a failed project of NATO from the start, and now it has been exposed as a failure, and the US has moved away from its other NATO partners where war is concerned. And from that point of view, quite frankly, the reality is that, I feel, as I said, very sorry for Ukraine. The Ukraine cannot win this war. It could not win this war at the beginning. It should not have begun this war in the first place. It was pushed into it by the US and some European countries. And frankly, now the European countries are footing the bill, and the US is sitting pretty under Trump because the Europeans are paying the Ukrainians money, and the Ukrainians are paying the Americans money to buy American weapons. So Donald Trump and the United States are making money out of the Ukraine war. The European side is losing, and meanwhile, a human tragedy is before us. Both Ukrainians and Russians are losing their lives, possibly even as we speak. So it's a real tragedy, this war. It ought never to have happened, but unfortunately, the Ukrainians were given delusions that they could seize back those territories, which frankly were delusions from the start. But as some of us have pointed out right from there, but I don't see that Zelensky is going to give up his zeal to quote-unquote reconquer, nor are the Europeans going to give up their futile hope for Zelensky doing so and pushing back the Russians. So I fear this loss of human life will continue for some more time.
Thank you, Madam Nalapat, for sharing that. Thank you very much. Now we move on to Middle East. Hezbollah has warned that there will be no life in Lebanon if the government seeks to confront or eliminate the group. A move it says could spark civil war. The government is pushing to control arms under a US-backed plan following Israel's military campaign against Hezbollah. The group insists it will not disarm until Israel ends its strikes. In a televised speech, Hezbollah's leader Naim Qassem accused the government of carrying out an American-Israeli order to eliminate the resistance, warning this could lead to internal strife. Let's listen in to what the Hezbollah leader had to say.
الحكومة اتخذت قراراً خطيراً جداً خالفت فيه ميثاق العيش المشترك، وهي تعرض البلد لأزمة كبيرة. لن تسلم المقاومة سلاحها والعدوان مستمر والاحتلال قائم، وسنخوضها معركة كربلائية إذا لزم الأمر في مواجهة هذا المشروع الإسرائيلي الأمريكي مهما كلفنا، ونحن واثقون أننا سننتصر في هذه المعركة. فلتجتمع الحكومة للتخطيط لمواجهة العدوان، هذه هي وظيفتها لتأمين الاستقرار وإعمار لبنان، لا لتسليم البلد إلى متغول إسرائيلي لا يشبع وطاغية أمريكي لا حدود لطمعه.
The conflict between Hezbollah and Israel erupted in October 2023 when Hezbollah opened fire at Israeli positions in support of Hamas, leading to heavy losses for the group and devastation in southern Lebanon. Calls for Hezbollah's disarmament have grown, but the group retains strong backing among Lebanon's Shiite community. For this discussion, we're joined by Matti Zweig. He's a geopolitical expert from Israel. Thank you, Matti, for joining us. Good to see you. Now, Hezbollah has...
Good to see you too.
Thank you. Now, Hezbollah has threatened civil war if the Lebanese government tries to confront or eliminate this group. So how does this statement reflect the deepening divisions within Lebanon?
Well, you know, Hezbollah didn't change. Hezbollah lost. They didn't change their core roots of being employees of Iran, armed and with salary that say you must all the time not to care about your own people in Lebanon, but to attack Israel and to try to help Iran. That's what they have been doing for more than 25 years. And that's what it happens now, that they are weakened. And the new government of Lebanon is trying to apply in the resolution 1701 that say that they must be disarmed from the Litani to the south, and they must not be rearmed from the Litani to the north and Beirut. So with the new president from January, Yosef Aoun, that he was also a military man, they are trying to push back to make order again in a country that was completely divided with two parallel armies, and now they are trying, of course, to oppose that. I mean, the government wants to control arms in line with the US-backed plan following Israel's military campaign against Hezbollah. And also they are trying to do this according to the law and the international decisions. And Hezbollah always have a good excuse to be a parallel army inside, or paramilitary inside a sovereign country called Lebanon. This is going to be maybe a bloodshed if they are going to treat with a civil war. I mean, if they really care about Lebanese unity, why are they threatening with a new civil war that has devastated the Lebanon in the 70s and in the 80s without having Israel in the middle? I mean, Israel finally also entered because it was also attacked. But you have to understand, always when you talk about Hezbollah, you are talking about a terrorist group that their aim is not to have Lebanese unity, but to do what Iran tells them to do.
And Maddie, now looking at the broader region here, Hezbollah insists it will not disarm until Israel holds its strikes on Lebanon. So what does this demand reveal about this broader power dynamics in the region?
This is not dynamics. This is the result of what they have done. You must understand, I mean, what is the Israeli occupation? Israel was outside Lebanon from 2000. We are 25 years after that. In 2023, in October, they had an excuse of helping their Gazan brothers, that they are not even their brothers because they are Shiite and Gazans are not. But anyway, again, by orders of Iran, they decided to attack massively Israel. Israel counterattack, entered inside, weakened it in a big time, in all kind of very big operations. If you remember, in Beirut and everything, and all the beepers operations and everything. Now they are weakened and they are trembling that they have to dismantle and give their arms and be part again of a sovereign country called Lebanon. And they are against it. I mean, all their excuses to attack again and again Israel, they cannot cover, you know, the root of the things. Israel is inside now only for their own security because the Lebanese army is receiving information from Israel where they can take the weapons from Hezbollah, but not in every place. Israel is based not inside Lebanon as a whole army, but in 5 points that they give them a strategical advantage until the Lebanese army is going to be deployed in all the international and agreed borders. So until then, this is a limited Israeli presence inside. It cannot be excused by Hezbollah trying to rearm and to re-attack Israel in the future.
Thank you very much, Matti Zweig, for sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next news. China's embassy in Japan has strongly condemned visits by Japanese politicians to the Yasukuni Shrine, saying that they reflect the lingering ghosts of Japan's militarism and a wrong attitude towards its history of aggression. In a statement, the embassy urged Japan to make a clean break with militarism, face up to and reflect on its past, and win the trust of its Asian neighbors and the international community. Through concrete actions, the embassy said such visits send the wrong signal at a time when regional trust and reconciliation are needed, calling on Tokyo to take responsibility for its history and demonstrate sincerity through deeds, not words. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Madhav Nalapat. He's an editorial director at TSG. Thank you, Madhav Nalapat, for staying with us. Now, looking at this news, given China's own human rights records and its assertive foreign policy, isn't there an element of hypocrisy in China condemning Japan over its historical action while facing its own issues in places like Xinjiang as well as Tibet?
You're quite right about Xinjiang and Tibet, not to mention Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, which were forcibly occupied by the Communist Army from 1949 onwards. But the reality of the situation is that the ordinary Chinese, not just communists, but ordinary Chinese, basically can't forgive the Japanese for what they did in China during World War II. I mean, the rape of so-called of Nanjing is now enshrined in history, and you have museums to that in both Taiwan as well as in the PRC. One situation in which both sides appear to have the same view. But the fact of the matter is that the Japanese are not going to stop visiting Yasukuni Shrine. It's a memorial for among them are a few people who are very much the leaders of the war, and the reality is that the Japanese have a tradition, an old Shinto tradition of revering their ancestors. So this is basically probably the relatives. This is directed at winning the vote of the relatives of those who basically perished, including as a consequence of the atomic attack on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. As for Japanese, moving back from the militaristic history, I think the Japanese have done so admirably. I mean, they are now the best friends of the same power that was the only power that launched, that till to date has launched nuclear weapons against any other country. And that's the United States against Japan during the close of World War II. So the Japanese have moved away from the history, the militarism, but the reality is you cannot change your history. And the history is so many hundreds of thousands of Japanese were killed in that war. I mean, the Japanese forces overran Malaya, Singapore, large areas which were under foreign occupation, French, British, and Dutch, and basically defeated them until they were themselves defeated by the Americans, notably on the high seas by their carrier fleet being destroyed in revenge for Pearl Harbor. But they're not going to stop visiting Yasukuni Shrine. I've been there, and I've been there basically because my host was actually one of his ancestors has been interred there. So I went there with him, and I found it a very quiet and tranquil place. I don't think it's militaristic in any way, and frankly, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to get popularity on the basis of rekindling memories of what the Japanese forces admittedly did in China during World War II. But yes, I quite agree with you. It's hypocritical because the Chinese have inflicted terrible, terrible human rights casualties and violations on Tibetans, on Uyghur, on Manchurians, on Mongolians, and including many Han Chinese. There's no question. There's more hypocrisy there.
Yes. I also agree with you that Japan cannot change their history no matter how long it has been. Thank you very much, Madam Nalapat, for joining us today and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on to North America. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that he is unconcerned about Brazil, Mexico, and Latin America strengthening ties with China, dismissing their economic performance and criticizing Brazil's trade policies and treatment of former President Bolsonaro. This comes after President Trump slapped a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods and financial sanctions on the Brazilian judge overseeing prosecution of the elder Bolsonaro, demanding an end to a witch hunt against the former president. Jair Bolsonaro is currently on trial before Brazil's top court over an alleged plot to overturn the 2022 election that he lost. According to reports, he denies any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Brazilian Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, has said that he expects additional U.S. sanctions against Brazilian officials and possibly more tariffs due to a legal crackdown on his father. Let's listen into what the U.S. president had to say.
No, not at all. I'm not concerned at all. They can do what they want. None of them are doing very well, and what we're doing in terms of economics, we're blowing everyone away, including China. We're doing better than any other country in the world right now. Brazil has been a horrible trading partner in terms of tariffs. As you know, they charged us tremendous tariffs, far, far more than we were charging them. We weren't charging anything, essentially. And Brazil has some very bad laws happening where they took a president and they put him in jail, or they're trying to jail him. And I happen to know the man, and I will tell you, I'm pretty good at people. I think he's an honest man. I think what they've done, this is really a political execution that they're trying to do with Bolsonaro. I think that's terrible. But they also treated us very badly as trading partners for many, many years. One of the worst countries on earth for that. They charged tremendous tariffs, and they made it very difficult to do anything. So now they're being charged 50% tariffs, and they're not happy, but that's the way it goes.
Now for this discussion, we go back to Matt Zweig. He's a geopolitical expert, joins us live from Israel. Thank you, Matty, for staying with us. Now looking at this news with President Trump dismissing the strengthening ties between Latin American nations and China, how do you see this shift? How do you see this shift in regional alliances affecting U.S. influence in Latin America?
Well, this has several factors because if you see along the road all the behavior of Trump about different countries and countries that he doesn't like, the way they are treating present or past presidents and the relation with courts, etc., it's not an easy thing because you jump immediately to something that happened in January 2020, that they were trying the same kind of things, say, about Donald Trump and his influence of not accepting the loss against Biden, etc. And now he's like having a kind of revenge about this. But anyway, the lawyers of Bolsonaro, they say that it was nothing like that, that this is a political chasing thing, and there is no way to convict Jair Bolsonaro, they say, based in the evidence presented in this case, which largely demonstrated that he ordered the transition and assured his voters that the war would not end on December 31st. Like, he accepted the loss and he didn't try to do any coup or something. So this is also, we must say truly, that this is different, this case, from the same case that Lula, the actual president of Brazil, was convicted for economical fraud that was really with facts shown in the courts. And I mean, he was in the Lava Jato and another affairs that put him for years in jail. And he was very popular, and he came back, and after some years he ran again. And now he's also a president trying to chase maybe politically his opponents. And then what you are looking is like a Tom and Jerry show. I mean, the cat is chasing the mouse, and then the mouse is chasing the cat. And this is what is going on now between all these actors. And this is not good because, anyway, this is also a blow to Donald Trump because he's showing the world that the decisions about tariffs, they are not only based on economical things, ideological thoughts. So I think this is a blown and a very bad message for the world that he mixes his own personal ideas and emotions with tariffs. And this is going to take a lot of points from him. But anyway, I think Donald Trump, he really doesn't care about these critics and continue his path.
Right. Thank you. That's interesting. Thank you very much, Matt Zweig, for sharing that insight and staying with us throughout our news. This is all we have time for.